Peace, y'all. I'm back with the Read Aloud series, part 2. And today we're going to be taking a look at The Unknown Citizen, a tribute to Langston Hughes and W.H. Auden by Yusuf Ras Tafari. I don't know if you can find the rest of this book, and typically the purpose here is for me to read a chapter or two from one of my favorite books that I've taught in the past, and for you to pick it up if you enjoy it, right? And I can't tell you that you'll be able to pick this one up. It's really a beautiful piece. It's meant to be read as spoken word, but also as prose too. You know, so the exposition here is musical and has a rhythm, but that doesn't make the content suffer at all. Right as soon as you open it, he acknowledges his father Alfonso. He opens it also with a foreword, saying, "I created this poetic novel as a result of a very brief but potent conversation I had with Dr. Daughtry Doc Long of Trenton, New Jersey, before my time. Doc Long is a noted poet and scholar who teaches the various methods of finer points of creative writing to his expression-hungry students, in and out of class. It so happened that he, Judith Williams, poet, and myself were down in Pennsauken for a jam session in the home of Eddie Rosado, musician. While we were waiting for Eddie to arrive, I thought of an idea of doing a narrative that was equal and harmonious blend of poetry and prose. I turned to Doc and said, 'Hey Doc, what do you think about a book that's combined of poetry and prose, where poetry is written alongside prose as prose?' He gave me a quick glance and said with a straight face and serious tone, 'You can't get better than that from a literary standpoint, because a book written like that would naturally make the reading more exciting and enjoyable.' When I went home and I started reading this, I canceled the rest of my day. You know what I mean? I told my girlfriend I couldn't see her that night, and I finished this whole book cover to cover in one sitting. So then I read it that time, I read it again, and then I read it a third time when I had to connect it to core content curriculum standards to teach it, right? That's not always an easy thing to do. In the district I was working, they really needed people that connected with the students in the class, and so therefore I got away with certain things by being able to inject stories, books, materials that weren't already part of the canon. I first became acquainted with Yusuf when I was in my very early 20s, maybe 2021, and he was presumably 40, if not just a little bit younger. He's probably close to 60 now, if not 60. Last time I saw him was about 10 years ago, and I was on my lunch break when I was teaching a class in Trenton, and I saw him in a ShopRite parking lot, and I sat and I had a moment to build with him, and he told me that he just had a stockpile of published and unpublished work at home. Unknown Citizen, Chapter 1. I, Brother J, citizen of Harlem, USA, was on my way from a food delivery I had on 131st and Broadway one day. I was headed toward the African Mart, where my honey in my heart was working a part-time job for Sakima, the flower woman, so I decided to pay a surprise visit on her, seeing that my next deliveries were there. Anyway, at the time I was not employed with the 9-to-5 system, nor was I working for the conventional private sector, but I was a part-time food runner for one Dr. L.W.G. Hazard, renowned holistic health healer and nutrition specialist who also dealt in herbs, tonics, and remedies. I was making extra cash as I mashed on the dash in a flash, a total hip cat proud to be black, wearing my Applejack with August heat on my back and Doc's food in my sack. The plates I was carrying were being delivered to the nude black entrepreneurial class of the Harlem community, who were high-profile, money-spending, business-minded franchise owners of the roaring 90s, going into 2000 and beyond, and with their various private ventures, they, who were conscious, striving to get away from the white-flowered, white-sugared, hog-based, and grease-filled victuals of their predecessors, and returning to the natural ways of healthy living and eating for vigor and strength, and not merely to satisfy the gut. Each aluminum foil dish was especially prepared by the doc himself, for that was his wealth on the stealth like an elf, while he kept the community sound in health. Each portion had been carefully measured, energized, decorated, and blessed with olive oil and sunflower seeds, to appear most simple and elegant of menus to his upwardly mobile class of consumers, to suit their newly acquired and sometimes hired aesthetic sense for what they chose to buy and internally consume. These were Doc's personal clientele, who had worked over the years to build up their businesses. Anyway, he just happened to hire Brother, and I was talking about making me his #1 food carrier. So I was walking with proud elation, sheer jubilation, with combined fascination for this new generation of their own black creation. And as I said, since my next deliveries were to the African Mart, hence the visit to my honey in my heart. It was late afternoon in the month of August, but the sun was still high in the sky, bathing everything with its warm, vibrant rays. The air, polluted as it was, had this calm, balmy scent, and coolness lingering heavily upon the congested molecules that mingled perfectly with the sights, sounds, fumes, and activities which were most common to Brother J and quite naturally familiar to this swarthy strip of Nazareth of New York City. It was one of those rare and memorable days of summer when the swift pace of time seemed to slow down and almost stand still for a few moments of grand nostalgia, sweet and sublime and mixed with all that is past, present, and future. It seemed to collide and mesh together for a few holy sequences of intercourse and personal revelation that was inherent in simply breathing the congested but balm-filled air, which verily oozed with thoughts and youthful impulses of lustful romance and swift biological union, anytime, anywhere. Then, I was feeling kind of frisky, risque, and ready to get down and lust with my special someone, whoever that might happen to be, but it just happened that it was my honey, Candy. She was my special someone above all others, and even though I was quite promiscuous at the time, I put all other honeys aside when it came to her, because she was just that real, down to earth, and loved Brother J with a love that was sublimely pure and wholeheartedly loyal and genuine. So as I was going along 125th Street, carrying the dock satchel of brown rice, baked fish, salads, and muffins, I felt pretty good about myself in most aspects, as I thoroughly absorbed the magnificent sun rays that beamed their mighty force and bounced off the pavement and soaked into the skins of the dark populace in this mini metropolis. It seemed like the whole of Harlem was outdoors, moving about, hustling and bustling along their various quests, hunts, missions, destinations, and rendezvous. They literally filled and overflowed the sidewalks and streets, each one, like Brother J, basking and soaking up the beautiful gleams of the heat light, the day being so sunny, balmy, and unique. Added to this, I was only 25 years old and feeling every ounce, bit, and fullness of my exuberant prime. In spite of being officially unemployed to the man downtown, I was active, fast, and footloose with all the vibrant impulses that make a young man thump, jump, hump, and bump. On the other hand, I was also under Doc Hazard's personal tutelage, learning the rudiments of real business and adult responsibility of conduct in dealing with this new black entrepreneurial class of folks, and my job as food deliverer was supposed to be a training lesson and joint venture in order to teach me how to use my mind and energies constructively instead of seductively, which was Brother J's natural way. That is to say, it was a simple design for me to deliver the plates and collect the cash on the doc's behalf, and from what I could measure from the pleasure and treasure of its success, I was much content with this indenture venture. As I approached Morningside Avenue, I began to hear in the distance the most beautiful, harmonious, angelic, melodious notes coming in chords playing on some high-frequency electric piano, whose sounds resembled that of harpsichords, violins, bell chimes, flute, and light percussions, all coming forth simultaneously and fluid with true soul-possessed exaltedness and majestic grandiosity, so much that it sent this ominous, eerie vibration through my entire anatomy, jolting my nervous system as it faced mystically and sliced through all that was shallow in my mind and penetrated me to the very depths of my being, my true, untainted self, which before I heard this particular music didn't know existed. It shook me, disturbed me, unnerved Brother J's equilibrium, capturing my full attention with its moans, groans, weeping, wailing, and gnashing of the teeth, while its godly strains and rhythms floated heavenward. It was the sweetest, saddest, kindest, and compassionate music I have ever heard in my young life, for it was totally unearthly and fully inspired within the deep contemplations of a sin and guilt-ridden soul that was crying out for repentance and redemption in a way that was as terrible and as beautiful as it was unspoken. But in notes and chords, I stopped, frozen in my steps, stilled into complete silence of mind and motion by the sheer simplicity of the melody that steadily maintained its divine integrity combined with its hellish screams of torment and ferocity. And strangely, this music, though lingering in the distance, seemed to be right up on me and having some kind of subliminal intercourse with everything that was going on at the moment. From the merchants selling their wares, to the number runners collecting their lots, to young, dark, exotic mothers pushing baby strollers, to hustlers hustling and the children playing and running in and out of the open hydrants, even with the scattered traffic of countless feet and wheels, the melodious tones blended perfect with it all and seemed so much more. It seemed to fill up and complete an almost perfect day of scenes and delights, and I was captured and held attentive, nearly enthralled, but not in the least against my will, for the sound made me burn with curiosity as to their source, and whether it was fully mortal or divine. The music was just as symphonically powerful and spiritually stirring, saturated with such genuine sentiment straight from the soul that made me want to laugh and cry together. Reasonably mesmerized, I found myself being magnetically drawn, even physically pulled, in the directions of the notes and chords, which happened to be the very path I was walking in. Yet, when I looked around me, I saw that no one else was, or seemed to be hearing or reacting to these very mysterious sounds like I was, or even though the gentle rhythms prominently filled the air, circulating clear above its palmy, polluted congestion. For a moment, I considered the possibility that this strange phenomenon might be going on in the confines of my own head. Because not so much as one other person, brother or sister, youth or elder, seemed in any way affected by the masterful harmony, and no one stopped even briefly to listen, wonder, admire, inquire where such sweet, relevant noise was coming from. Realizing that I was the only one having this kind of reaction to it, I felt that this peculiar music was calling to me and me alone, that it was beckoning me, pulling me and begging me to come where it was, to stand in awe of its vibrational rhapsody, wanting me to love it and commune with it, without words of criticism or praise, without any sign of approval or disapproval, but only to go there and listen and appreciate. Then my whole heart, every pulsation in me, was overcome with a sudden yearning for it, as my ears began to tingle with this heaven resonance. Unable to resist its drawing powers any longer, my feet, seemingly without the full cooperation of my brain, began to move mechanically in the straight path of the music, as my shaded eyes vigorously searched for a human form behind it. I surrealistically went along, completely torn from out of my former steps of jitterbugging and bop, and I really couldn't stop because the thing had blown my top. My intuition, however, was preparing me for something not entirely earthly, nor typically environmental as I knew it. I say again that this music was just that awesome and beautiful. And even now I, Brother J, am fully aware how adjectives are insufficient to describe this indescribable. Nonetheless, I was hypnotically and physically taken over by the sovereign, sobbing piano harmonic strains dancing around me, through me, and with me, that no one seemed to notice enough to be bewitched by. And I wondered again, moving closer, the sounds of heaven and hell getting more intense. If this was all going inside of my head, now that I was feeling more acutely an actual spell being casted over me. It was like I was entranced to another dimension, a twilight zone composed of shadow and imagination, but very little of this scenario could I identify as concrete. For its serpent-like spell, and I repeat, here again, it was paradise and hell. And there we have an illustration. I was strictly gliding now, my shopping bag of the doc's health victuals swinging leisurely alongside me. I was floating like vapors, rhythmically, yet I continued to peer through my dark shades cautiously, scanning ahead, searching eagerly for that stirring source of musical force with a mind to endorse with no remorse, of course. Then, in another split moment, the entire episode became so pure, perfect, and natural, that to simply follow the chords and notes became my singular focus, to see the musician behind that magnificent harmony my only goal, for I now felt as if I were an actual part of this mellifluous symphony, but more than that, hungering for it, needing it, like I needed the sunshine of the day, and almost like the blood in my veins or the breath in my nostrils, I found myself forcing my own curiosity upon its equally. It was gripping me with its power. The heat of the day intensified with the sun at its apex, and even at this much closer range, all the folks on 125th Street were passing casually to and from, paying the beautifully mysterious music absolutely no mind. As it swarmed about in all directions, great chocolate numbers, then I began to fix my eyes upon a vague figure of a man about 30 years yonder. The figure danced, swelled, swayed, and vibrated in elusive heat waves that bounced off the pavement, and I moved slowly forward, extremely peaceful, and at the same time helplessly zombie-like in a sublime trance, the satchel of Doc's victuals loose in my hands. Chapter 2. When I grew close enough to perceive the master behind this fantastically stirring rendition, I walked even more slowly, and for reason unbeknownst to me, my legs became somewhat wobbly, so much that I found myself inching towards him in a very conservative creep, and I felt that this was the very unnatural response to actually seeing him, because I fully expected to run up on him with outstretched arms, laughter in my throat, and mist in my eyes, proclaiming his absolute mastery of music and blubbering my personal admiration. Instead, I experienced a sense of total submission of my will, as the heavenly, hellish strains continued to delight and molest my soul with its deeply spiritual jabs and strokes. And yet, from the vague distance at which I saw him, I was squinting in the sunlight. The musician did not appear to be that impressive looking, and soon my conservative creep turned into a caterpillar-like step, until I found myself moving up him sideways, meandering like a sand snake, sensing by the utter mysteriousness of his tunes that I could not just come upon him directly or approach him in any kind of way, lest I intrude upon his fragile concentration. He seemed totally unashamed as he held open his wide musical gates of paradoxal duality before the sun-drenched afternoon. I stopped about 10 feet from where he was playing, and it struck me that in spite of this awesome power and talent that he wielded over his electronic piano, as well as the profound spiritual movement by which he was manifesting it, that this strange fellow did not even have a listening audience as his immediate area, not so much as one attentive listener. Shocked, I took off my shades, cleaned them to make sure I was seeing correctly, and then put them back on. But still he had no audience. I continued my slow meandering for a few more feet toward him, until I finally stood in front of him, poised and silent under his personal hypnotic roots voodoo, as he swayed and rocked from side to side, with tears in his eyes and nothing like pride in his being. And Brother J could not believe he was seeing what he was seeing. His brown fingers danced upon piano keys, creating nostalgia in the light August breeze, while he shook his head and tapped his feet for disinterested Harlemites on 125th Street. He didn't seem to notice my lone presence in the least. As I scanned him up and down through my 2 dark windows, I wanted to speak to him immediately, to tell him how soulful and deep he was, and how pure angelic strains of harmony had brought me to him, and yet a natural self-consciousness kept me from opening my mouth, because I was even more enthralled by what I was hearing at such close range, and I could still not fully understand or believe that he and I were the only ones who appeared to hear it. And yet, when I arrived, I was content just to stand there before him in the heat of the August sun, to listen, admire, and absorb the magnificent power of his work, to bear witness as I had been subliminally summoned to do, and I could not help but to become increasingly aware as I stood engrossed in his performance, that for all these passing Harlemites cared, this odd fellow might as well have been playing his tunes in a cemetery. And I wondered how any people proud, proclaiming and calling themselves originators of the culture and civilization could pass idly as a such phenomenon could not be completely overcome by this obvious thing from God. What made my wonderment turn to indignation was that everyone appeared to move in perfect syncopation with the style in which he was playing, and yet to them he could have been there or not been there. It would have made no difference, and this to me was insulting. For anyone with true hip cat eyes could plainly see that this musician dude was highly spiritualized and fully into what he was playing, that he was not so much performing for the pleasurable entertainment of the public ear, but for some deep repentance, atonement, and redemption of his own soul. I didn't completely realize this when I dwelt in his strange symphonic realm, but I certainly do now. He was well into his 60s or early 70s and looked every bit of his ancient days, and then some. He was a black man with a creamed coffee complexion that was heavily creased and creviced with stonily etched wrinkles, each one rugged and hard upon his face. His cheeks were drawn and hollow, and his jaw and chin were transparently gaunt and veiny. His mouth was pulled downward in a perpetual frown, and he had the deepest, saddest, crying, greenest green eyes I'd ever seen. And yet they were mean and keen with their glassy sheen, that split through the soul and spliced up the spleen, that terrified me with their piercing gleam, till reality departed and I stood in a dream. His eyes were like 2 tumultuous lakes of emerald fire, wild and rampageous, barely contained by the 2 flaming orbs that held them in check, for they seemed if they would burst from their sockets and consume me in a swift moment. They were filled with his longing desire, his aching heart, his nightmarish head, his horribly troubled past, his unbearingly anguished present, and his morose and tormented future. Most of all, there was in his staunch and steadfast clinging to death more than life, for they were spilling the most profuse and pathetic flow of tears, bitter and disgustingly beautiful, as he stared directly into the face of the sun, more spirit than flesh, but insofar as his personal anguish, more of a beaten beast than a human being. Yet, though he stared directly into the intense blinding sunbeams, he did not so much as blink for the power of the rays. Heavy brownish-gray brows sat heavily over his terrible eyes, adding so much to their look of trouble and trial, with not so much as one sign of heavenly blessedness or mortal peace, like that which flowed from his instrument. His balding head was slicked back with the few strands of hair he had left from years of frying it, lying it, and dyeing it, conking it with the half-assed process in the days when it was fashionable, and then he held it combed was a meager attempt to cover up the near entirety of his baldness, with the few salt-and-peppered strands he had. He wore a large black and red checkered shirt and Levi's that were somewhere between clean and dirty, but the most striking thing about him were those pair of fearsome, burning green emerald lakes of his. Truly, they were the only outstanding noticeable feature on his face, and it seemed to me right then that those unusual glowing lamps were the only element holding his whole face together, and that for the sole purpose of the many years that ran out of them, they ran down his face like a waterfall of sorrow and a flood of regrets, so that the irises of them were nearly blood red as he continued to stare into the face of the sun, not seeing Brother J, not seeing anyone. Just two burning spheres that held within them all his hurt, humiliation, torment, desire, and indignation, pride and honor, and mental flagellation, yet full submission. Contrition, as thoroughly whipped in an unseen rod, I thought him a musical prophet of God. They were round and bulbous like a fish's, and from the way he continually stared into the sun without blinking, I naturally began to presume that there was no sight in them whatsoever, and to not become unduly overwhelmed by his extraordinary lamps. I focused some of my attention to his perpetual frown that was aged etchly into the diamond-like hardness of his years. But no matter where I looked on his face, he showed absolutely no sign of a man who was the least bit happy with his life, or even tolerant. This was one of the most striking ironies that I, Brother J, had ever witnessed. Such beauteous and soul-stirring orchestration coming from a person of the most horrible, wretched, and freakish-looking character that was almost a caricature. As he continued to stroke those hypnotic chords that were strains of flavored with dancing, tingling, and individual notes, his pitiable, profuse flow of tears watered his face and filled up the creases in his neck, and even round down his chest, when I marveled with nothing less than dumb amazement, suddenly feeling that my own identity was somehow in jeopardy, my own sense of self becoming regressively insignificant as it paled against his presence, so much so that I felt myself being absorbed into his very person, as much as his playing, until they both wrapped around me like a psychedelic multi-dimensional blanket that totally snatched me from out of my hip-cat bebop slapjack hip-hop frame of mind. He kept staring directly into the face of the sun, and I kept wondering how he could do this, seeing how the average person could not without quickly turning away from the intense glare of it. Then he turned and looked at me briefly and smiled at me with a sickly, unforgettable grin. So right there, I knew he wasn't blinded after all. Again, I wanted to speak to him outright, my sentiments of his musical talent, but my mind couldn't find the words on time to tell him what I thought in his chime sublime. But he could see. He could actually see out of those two burning green things. He could perceive shapes and images upon him taking notice of me. He began to harmonize even more deeply than before, rocking and swaying in exact proportion to his crying and playing. He was indeed a master, a virtuoso, a sheer messiah in the most denotive sense, but the next thing I knew, he was staring back at the sun, striking heavier internal chords, and leaning from side to side like Ray Charles, rocking and swaying, crying and mumble-praying, unashamed, and it filled me with icy hot stabs of fear, pain, and ecstasy, with soul-crushing twangs and licks shooting down the nape of my neck, engulfing my spine, piercing my liver, and causing me to shudder against the all-assuming, the matchless symphony of his magical, musical prowess. He looked from the corner of his eye and seemed to know that I was completely overwhelmed by his deliberate and subliminal attack on my nervous system, as he had planned it that way even before I came into his presence, and he purposefully struck those particular chords again, only to see me shudder again, and seeing me do so, he laughed to himself. And even while the tears were yet streaming down his face, it was a silent laugh, a held-in chuckle, just shy of breaking forth into a full humorous hysterics that was overshadowed only by his malignant sorrow. Then, giving this full attention back to the face of the sun, he suddenly cried out in ugly anguish, "O great God, Israel, have mercy on my wretched soul. Forgive me, Father. Don't let sin follow me to my grave." And then he began to weep audibly as well as visibly, and I could not imagine in my wildest stretch what could make a being like this so wonderfully talented and soulful, and at the same time so miserably sad and dejected. I wanted to ask him that very question, but in the extremely enlightening moments of his rendition, whenever it was he was playing, all questions, relevant or not, were definitely taboo. I dared not to interrupt him in the midst of his melody, nor the barrage of a melancholy serenade, nor break the harmony of his one-man parade, for he was college level, and I was first grade. I was a mere observer, but he was musically had it made. Aside from that, he was so attuned with his orchestration, so obviously wrecked in his physical state, that it made him seem too far away and too mortified into the religion of his piano to answer even the simplest of questions. His very aura was mystical. Even as his physical frame was puny and gaunt with certain malnutrition, he looked skeletal all over as his bony brown fingers danced across the keyboard, delicate as crystal, and his super greens never ceased to bleed those magnetic, troublesome tears, and the power and grip of his anguish became so intense that I felt myself, if I could still call myself, personally experiencing his every moan, groan, sigh, and cry of his breath as I was translated through notes, chords, lulls, and crescendos. I wanted to leave, and I wanted to stay. For I could have listened for the rest of the day, but I knew that I had to be on my way to deliver the menus and get Doc's pay. And yet I could do nothing but listen, observe, and silently obey. Whew! Serious writing, right? Hope you guys enjoyed that. I don't know if there's any way of getting a copy of this. And if I could point you in the direction, I would. This was one of those books that not only helped shape the way that I looked at literature and what was possible to do with literature and prose, but also was something that really inspired my students many years in a row. So much respect to Yusuf Ras Tafari, the unknown citizen. Peace.